through 4.3 today, but we're only going to go through part of it because there's actually a lot in this chapter, probably more than makes sense to cover today. So the first part that we're going to go over today is all dealing with menus and different ways that we can use menus. And what we'll get into tomorrow is how to deal with dialogues and how to deal with date and time pickers. In that process, tomorrow I'm also going to add a little bit more to the slides because we need to talk about how we work with dates and times in Android and Java in general, because there's a lot of kind of gotchas with working with dates and times, especially as things have changed. So it used to be kind of, there's some older APIs going back to 1.0, 1.1, which have a lot of issues and have been replaced by something newer in Java 8. So we kind of need to talk about what those are. A lot of the code examples that you see out online are still going to be using that older set of code. And a lot of companies are still using that since the newer version only got into Android in version 26, which means there's only so many devices that have that newer version. So let's get into menus. So there's a bunch of different ways that we can use menus. And we're going to talk about each of these. So the first thing I can do, is maybe the easiest that you've kind of seen maybe in the basic template, is that I can put icons and what we call an overflow menu up on the top of the action bar, right? So I've got icons up there that I want to be available all the time, right? Common actions that exist for that screen, as well as maybe a drop down this menu that has additional items for what I can do. Okay, so that's one way we can use it, and that's probably the most common. The next way that we can use it is we can use it as what we call a context menu, right? So in the world of desktop applications, right, a context menu is typically I right-click on something, I get this pop-up, right? I right-click it and I get a few options like copy, paste, etc. However, in the world of Android, the way you get there, well, remember there's no right-click, right? So the way we get there is through a long press. Remember we talked about gestures the other day? Long press. So you hold on to, you press an item down for a second or two, and this context menu appears, right? The third thing we have in here is this contextual action bar, which kind of works like a context menu, but instead of being something that pops up as a window, it actually replaces the existing action bar, right? So the action bar might look like this, with some icons and the overflow menu, but once the user long presses on an item, it switches to be different, so that we're in a different mode. Okay? So that has a lot of benefits. This is probably the hardest of the three to kind of work because there's a lot of gotchas, but there's a lot of value to this system. There's a lot that can be done with it. There's a lot of apps that can use it. The fourth option, and probably the least used, is that we can pop up a menu not just from the action bar and not just as a context menu, but from any view. So any view you can say, hey, either you do a click or a long press on this, and we'll pop up a menu with some options. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So that might be something that you're more familiar with, a traditional sort of context menu. But it's the one we use the least because it's usually the hardest one to tell that it's even there. Users don't usually know that it's there. So we're going to go through all of those. All of those are going to use something new, which we'll go over, which is a menu resource. It's another XML file, and actually go into the menus folder. There's a whole folder for it because we'll have enough of these. We'll also tomorrow talk a little bit about dialogues. So you've got on the left, you've got the alert dialog, which we can use for general sort of prompts. Usually we use those for yes or no. Are you sure you want to do this? Do you agree to the terms of service, etc.? So we'll see that tomorrow. Also in there we can have pop-ups that are date pickers or time pickers. And that kind of works in a similar sort of mechanism. So we'll look at that tomorrow as well. And as we look at those, that's where I'll come in and talk some more about time and dates and how we work with those. But this is the part that we'll touch on tomorrow. We're just going to cover those 4 today. So let's go over the action bar first. So this always appears on the top, and then you can see that there's a few different sections. Several of these are optional. We always have a title, nearly always. So there's going to be that title in the middle. And remember where that comes from? Where does that title come from? Okay, not necessarily. Where does it come from? It can come from the app name. Okay, string XML. You're getting there. If I wanted to change this title, where do I need to go? What file do I need to go into? So let's go through that. So if I open up one of these apps, remember the Android manifest, or our good old friend? If we go into here, remember there's an activity tag for each screen, right? So if we don't specify the title for that particular screen, it will just go off of the app label, this label up here, which is the app name, if I don't specify a title specifically for that screen. But if I want to specify a title specifically for that screen, which I really should do if I have more than one screen, I don't want them all to say the same name. All I have to do is add in a label attribute. So Android label, and this would be, say, main screen. Again, I could put that in a strings XML, but really the important point is that if I want the title of the screen to be different, I need to set it using Android label in the actual activity tag. Does that make sense? So I can set this one to be main screen. I can set this one to be user list. And that's what will appear as the actual name of the screen. So that's how we do that. Okay. The navigation drawer, which we'll talk about in another chapter, is this triple bar that shows up here on the left. You don't have to have a navigation drawer. Okay? A navigation, and if you do have a navigation drawer, it typically only appears on your main screen. So what a navigation drawer is it's kind of this pane you can pull out from the left side. I think sometimes it can pull up from the right as well, but usually it's from the left side. Make sense? So sometimes you can get there by swiping out, or you can hit this button to pull that out. So that's where you get to additional options and such. One of the most common apps that has that, if you look at the Play Store app, the Play Store app, that has an app, has a navigation bar. So that's where you would see that. Again, that is optional. Okay. The next thing that we have in here, which is one of the next things we're going to talk about, is, hey, I've got some icons here, right? I've got some icons, and these are specifically, well, they're buttons, right? So I get an icon, and I can make them do something when the user clicks on them. That make sense? So they're kind of like buttons that are up outside of the main part of your app. And then finally, what we have here at the end, that fourth part, is what we call the overflow button. So any of these action buttons that don't fit will go into the overflow. So that's one of the reasons that one of the ways that we handle different screen sizes, right? So if you're at a larger screen size, you might be able to put all of those buttons up top, right? If I'm on a 7-inch or a 10-inch tablet, I might be able to put 5 buttons up there. But if I'm dealing with a phone, I can probably only put 1 or 2 icons safely. Does that make sense? So that's where that comes in. Now, the way we define both these icons here and that overflow, we're actually going to define that in the same menu resource, and we'll see how that works. But both of those are part of the menu. So the gist is we want to put the important items up there outside of the overflow menu, the most likely things that the user is going to use so they can get to them quick. However, because we're only showing an icon, right, not text, we also need to make sure that it's really clear what that icon's going to do, right? So if it's not clear, you really need text to explain what that icon is, you're probably better off leaving it in the overflow menu. Does that make sense? Probably better off leaving it in the overflow if it's not clear just by looking at the icon. And we generally use these for a few reasons, for a few different reasons, mainly for getting to other activities. A common one to put in here is how to get to the settings screen or the preferences screen, which we'll talk later about in kind of Unit 4, how to set up a preference screen. But that's one of the common items that shows up there. Okay, and other screens that you may want to show up here. Here they've got, you see favorites and contact. Both of those are other screens that the user can navigate to, but they're kind of hidden in that overflow menu. So how do we add an options menu like that? So the first thing we need to do is we need to create an XML resource. So we need to create an XML resource. We generally call this main or menu underscore main. You'll see that all of these resources, we typically start with menu underscore. Kind of like, remember when we started activities, we're going to do like activity layouts, we're going to do activity underscore. So we have a prefix for these. Does that make sense? So it'd be main, it'd be menu underscore whatever we're using it for. Okay, so in this case, I'm using it on the main activity. If I was going to use it on, say, the second activity, I might call it main underscore second. Okay, once we've done that, the next thing we have to do is implement this onCreateOptions menu to inflate the menu, which is going to say, I want to specify which menu resource to use and turn that into an actual menu view, right? Turn it into the actual GUI, the UI controls is what that does, okay? Once we've got that, now the user can actually see the menu. Once we've done those two parts, if we don't do either of those two parts, the user can't actually see the menu in the first place. We can then implement the onOptions item selected. So both of those methods are methods we're going to implement on the activity. We're actually overriding existing methods. So that says, okay, here's what you want to do when the user clicks on it, right? So when they open the menu, they're going to call onCreateOptionsMenu. When they pick an item is when we're going to see onItems selected. Okay, and then finally we kind of need to build in a method to say, here's what I want you to do if you say click on settings or favorites, right? Here's the actual logic that happens. So we typically don't want to put all the logic into either of these methods, onCreateOptionsMenu, onOptions item selected. We usually want to keep those pretty small. So we'll extract the actual logic to another method. So how do we create the menu resource? So if I open up Android Studio, and you can do this with any project you may have available to you, we're going to right click on the resource folder. I'm going to say new. And just like we've done before, this is how you create activities, layouts, images. We're going to go into here and create a menu resource, which, let's see. I remember where that is. So widget, okay, so let's create a menu folder first. So res folder. No, that's not what I want. I don't want a res folder. I want an asset folder. where was I? There, folder. So I want assets folder. No, that's not what I want. Where is that item? We've moved it. Gosh, where did that one? Directory. Menu. Okay, so I've got a menu directory. And then I want, oh, there, new menu resource file. Okay, so I want new menu resource file. The file name is going to be main_menu. Yes. So it's going to create a basic menu file. Nothing's really in there except that it has the menu tag around it. See that? So that's kind of the starting point. Just like your values files, right, has a resources tag around it. So inside of the menu tag is where we want to add these items. Okay. So those are the actual items that are going to show up in the menu. Okay. So we use the item tag for that. They always have to have an ID, and they generally an ID and a title, right? So the ID is again the ID we're going to use in code when that item is selected, and the title is what the user is going to see, right? So if I take what I have there, they have option settings and option favorites, so I can add in those items. Item Android ID. Actually, can I just copy that from here? Yeah. So if I put that in here, there we go. I still need to extract those resources, right? It's kind of giving me that suggestion, so I should still extract those strings. But if I look at the preview, right, I've got this preview tab open, you can kind of see what it's going to look like already, right? So there's a little ... overflow, and it's showing me what those items are going to look like. Okay, so by default, I do have to, any of these items always have to have an ID and a title. That's kind of the minimum, right? Now, what I also usually want to add to that is to add an icon, okay, which I guess I'll come back to in a minute. So that's the basic setup. Create the menu file, 2 items in it. And then the next thing I want to do is actually write the method to create that menu or use that menu. So if I go into the activity, so in the activity, I'm going to override that onCreate option menu. onCreate options menu. And I need to say get inflator, get menu inflator, and I'm going to tell it to inflate. So the first argument there is what resource do I want to use? So I'm going to start with r.menu, right? So this is a menu resource. So kind of like I would do strings, it's as r.string, I'd do r.menu, and then I just have the one resource main menu. Okay. Now I also need to give it the actual menu object to inflate it. So all the ways that we see how to inflate menus today, all 4 different ways, are going to kind of start with this basic formula. You have to get a menu inflator and then tell it to inflate with the resource ID of the menu and then the actual menu object. So it's going to take what's in that resource and fill it into that menu. Does that make sense? Now, where we get this menu inflator is going to change depending on the context. So in this case, we're just pulling the menu inflator from the activity, okay, which is kind of the most common. And but again, as we kind of go through these different ways to do things, you'll see that that menu inflator sometimes comes from other sources. Okay. Now, finally, the last thing I need to do to implement this method is I need to tell it to return true. So onCreateOptionsMenu returns a Boolean that says, do you want to continue with inflating this menu, or do you want to stop? Do you want to abort? So if I return false, I won't actually get an overflow menu. I'll click on the button and it won't do anything. Does that make sense? So it gives you a way to say, well, under these conditions, maybe I don't have a menu. Or in these conditions, I do have a menu, right? So if you have, let's say, hey, admins get this menu and regular users get this other menu, or if you're not logged in, you don't get a menu at all, it kind of gives you that functionality, okay? Now, one thing to know, though, on that front, this only gets called once. Just like onCreate only ever gets called once, this only ever gets called the first time that the user opens a menu. It doesn't get called from there on. And it also doesn't get called immediately when the user sees the screen. Okay? It doesn't get called until they click that triple dot to open the menu. Does that make sense? Until it needs the menu, it doesn't call this. But that's really all I have to do to put the menu there, right? So if we were to run the app right now with just those two things in place, the menu resource and the onCreate options menu, what I should see is there. Now I'm not seeing the triple dot, so what am I missing? Oh, it hasn't run yet. Okay. There we go. So I'll see the triple dot now. That's where it expands, gives me settings or favorites. But if I pick any of these, I haven't told it what to do, so it's not going to do anything. So if I want it to get it to actually do something with that, I need to implement the onOptionItem method. Okay. So similarly, how I started the onCreate. I'm going to start by implementing that method. And the first thing, it takes a menu item, right? So that's kind of the thing that the users pick, but it's not actually a view. It's one important thing to know. A menu item isn't really a view in a typical sense. Okay? But I can say get item ID. Okay? So that'll give me the ID of whatever it is in the resource file. Remember? So I put option favorites, option, or here I've got action settings, action favorites. So if I pick that, it's going to run this code, this case. Show the settings, return true to say, hey, we handled it, we showed something to the user. Show favorites, we did something, which that return true kind of says, okay, you can close it now. You can close the menu. And then finally, if it's anything else, the default, we're going to go back to the parent class. And that's one thing you want to make sure that you always have in there, is that the default goes back to the parent class. Does that make sense? So we're going to have a big switch in there for all our statements. But this is why we don't want to put any of the logic into there, because this would get really messy if we had all the logic for showing settings, showing favorites, etc., all in this one method. Okay. So we're going to extract anything for the show settings, what actually happens when you pick that option, into another method. What you fix when you show the favorites, we're going to extract it to another. And that's an important thing to remember for all of the ways that we put in the menu, all the 4 ways. We want to make sure that the actual logic of the menu is somewhere else. Because otherwise we end up with these giant switch statements that have way too much logic. So we can also add icons to our menus. So similar to how we've kind of done before, we're going to add an icon and then we're going to assign it in the XML. Okay, so if I go to here, we have a a favorites icon and a settings, right? We have those two items in the menu right now. So I want to make icons for both of those. Okay, so I'm going to go to Drawable. I'm going to right click there. I'm going to say New Image Asset. We're going to call this one Image IC Settings. And I want to pick a little gear icon for that. There, settings. Okay, so there's my settings icon. I'm going to call it IC Settings. Go ahead and save it. And I'm also going to add the icon for favorites. So new image asset, IC favorites, and let's find a star icon for that. Okay, so does that make sense? We need to start by creating those icons kind of like we saw previously. Now, in order to actually use the icon, I need to go and associate it with the menu item. Okay, so the way I do that is I'm going to say Android icon and use this drawable resource, kind of like we saw with an image view. So Android icon, and we're going to say IC setting. Yeah, there, IC settings. And here I want Android icon IC favorites. Okay. So that puts the icons in there, and they will get used whenever they can. Does that make sense? So the other thing I need to do, if I want these to actually now come up and not be in the overflow, I need to set two settings. So first of all, I need to set their order, and I also need to tell them that they should be able to show as an action. Okay. So in here, I'm going to add Android order and category, and this can be any integer, but it's usually safe to go in multiples of, it's usually best to go in multiples of 10. That way you have room to insert things later without renumbering all the menu items. So if we want to say that the settings option is first, and then the favorites is next, I would say this is 10 and this is 20. Does that make sense? So that's going to change where they're ordered. That's also going to affect them as far as which things come up and become just icons or action buttons instead of overflow items. So to do that, I'm going to go in and show as action, and there's a few options here. So we can say always, which is going to say put it there all the time, regardless of whether or not there's space. That's usually something you want to avoid, because who knows, the device might be so small that it can't fit, or your title might be so big that your title's already taking up all the space. So typically we want to go here and say if room. So if there is room for the icon, then show it. Does that make sense? We can also pick never, which is kind of the default that says, well, never bring it up as an icon. Okay, those are things that are specifically, well, these are always going to be in our overflow menu. So we're going to change that to if room, and I'm going to do the same thing here for that. Okay, so if we look here, you can see how both of these have come up as icons. Right, so there's a gear icon and there's a setting icon. If I run it on the device, we'll see that that's changed. Okay, so you can see they're both here, right? They're kind of dark, right? They're kind of hard to see. Why is that? I have to change some setting, right? When I just created this, I kind of took the defaults, right? So they're showing up dark. It works, but it's not very user friendly. So because I have a dark action bar, I actually want them to be light, preferably white. Okay. So the way I want to do that, I actually need to recreate the icons. I can't just simply change the icons after they've been created, because if I look at these PNG files, you can guys see they're already gray. Okay, so I want them to come out white. So I'm going to go add the images again. So new image asset. I'm going to say I see favorites. This time I'm going to, however, go over to hollow dark. Okay, that's the trick. So I go over to hollow dark. You can kind of see that there's a warning down here. It says an icon with the same name already exists. It will be overwritten. So when I recreate this, it's just going to have the same name as the one that's already there. So you can see it's come out as white. I can do the same thing with my settings icon. I just need to recreate it. So if you do get in the situation where it's dark or light when you wanted it to be the other way around, that's really all you have to do, is you just have to go and recreate the icon. You don't have to change any code as long as you keep the same name. So does that make sense? You can see what's happening there? So I have them up here as buttons instead of being in that drop-down menu. And again, I usually want to do that with the common icons. That makes it a little bit easier on the user. And again, if I want to switch the order of these, I can change that order and category. So this would be, say, 10 and 20, and they're actually going to switch. Because usually if I do have a gear icon, the expectation is that that's farthest to the right. Does that make sense? Usually the expectation is that's towards the left. But you'll also notice in there, right? So now they're appearing not in the order that they are in the XML. They're appearing from the lowest order number to the highest order number, right? So the order that you have them doesn't really matter. But I would recommend putting them in the order that you expect them to show up, just for readability purposes, right? So it doesn't matter that they're this way, but it does make it more readable if you at least arrange them in the order that they're going to appear. Okay. All right, so we've added icons there. Let me go ahead and add the on options items selected. Add that in real quick, just so we can see what that looks like. Okay. So to make them do something, I'm just going to add those methods, public or private void show settings, and another one for show favorites. So I have those two methods there. I think they got called option, yeah. So this would need to be option, because of what it is in the XML. So option settings, option favorites. Okay. So what can I do in here that would make this at least do something that I could prove that it's working? Right. I don't want to go create the whole screen, but I want it to do something. Show a toast, right? So toast is a really good, again, a really good tool for testing purposes. So I'm going to say in here, toast.makeText, and we'll pass in the context. We'll pass in a message, settings, sort. There we go. So in theory, I should get those tests. So favorites, settings, all good. Okay, so the big thing to know there is for all of the stuff that we're going to be doing, we'll be using those menu resources, right? So you create them under the resource folder. They'll go into the menu folder, and you can kind of preview them using this preview tab. Okay. Any more questions about the menu resource? Because this is actually the last time I'm going to touch the menu resource. We'll go through how to do all the other stuff, and the rest of the stuff really just involves touching the Java code. The other ways of creating menus, they all stay the same. This is the way you create a menu, regardless of which way you show a menu. All good? I generally recommend giving all of your menu items an icon, just for the sake of being prepared for different versions of Android that may treat that differently. But that's how you create that resource. This is the basic structure for creating a menu. So we're going to see this for the different kinds of menus that we create as well. We have the first one, which actually creates the menu or inflates the menu, and then we have a method that handles when the user picks an item, right? So we have those two methods. So regardless of what way you set up a menu, you're going to have those two parts. Does that make sense? We always have to inflate the menu, and then we always have to handle when the user picks an option. Okay. Now, the names of these methods will change. Okay. So these are these ones, on create options menu, on options item selected. These are only for the action bar. Okay. So the names of the methods will be different if we're showing a menu in a different context. That makes sense? So you may end up with a bunch of these methods. Bunch of methods like this. Let's talk about contextual menus. So these allow the user to do something kind of on a particular view. We can use them really on any kind of view. It doesn't matter what kind of view it is. It could be a text view, could be an edit text, could be an image view, could be a spinner, could be any of those things. Okay. Now, typically the way we're going to deploy them is you do a long press on that item and then it shows up. Okay. We use this most with recycler view, grid view, or kind of any collection of views where you're seeing a kind of a list of items, right? So recycler view is going to be the most common place where you see something like this, but we haven't talked about recycler view yet. Does that make sense? Anytime you're doing a list. So you think about even your shopping list, you've got 10 items, you might respond to if the user does a long press on one of those items. So maybe they do a long press and then they get the option to delete it or edit it or whatever they may need to do with it. So typically that's going to show up this way. The context menu you see is going to show up like a little pop-up, right? Little alert dialog. We'll also go over these in a minute. We can do these contextual kind of, where we change the action bar. This works well as long as I only want to change one item. This works better when we want to change multiple items at the same time. Makes sense? So this in some senses also, that means that this is a little bit easier because I'm only ever working with one item, whereas this is a little bit harder because I might be dealing with multiple items at once. But what we're talking about right now is first just this version, and then we'll come back and talk about how we do that. So if I want a floating context menu, like a dialog there, again, my first step is to create a menu resource, right? So I probably will create another menu resources for this one specifically, right? So the first one I called menu underscore main, I might call this one menu underscore context, or I might be more specific and say this is the image one or the second one, because I may have more than one context menu on a particular screen. Make sense? Or I might have one screen has this context menu, the other screen has this context menu. So I usually need to name these in a way that I can know which screen they go with and which control they go with. Once I've done that, I'm going to call this register for context menu. That's going to actually hook up the listener to say, when you do a long press on an item, then I want to show this context menu. Remember that I want to do something. Okay. Then we're also going to implement onCreateContextMenu. Remember the other one was onCreateOptionsMenu. So this is onCreateContextMenu. Okay, so I'm going to implement that. We can kind of guess what's that going to do. Well, it's going to inflate the menu, right? Just like on options, onCreateOptionsMenu inflated it. This one's going to inflate the context menu. Okay. And then we have another method here on context item selected is when the user actually picks an item from that context menu. That makes sense? So it's kind of the same structure that we had previously, but when we talked about the action bar, that was the entire activity, right? The entire activity only has one action bar, so we don't have to deal with, hey, binding it up. It's already bound. But here we can say, I'm interested in showing a context menu for these particular controls. That makes sense? So I may want to show it only for some controls, or I may want to say for this control gets this context menu, for that control I get a different. Okay. So step one, we create the menu. Here we're going to call it menu underscore context. And it's going to have two items. So we have an edit and we have a share. Right? So I can either edit the item or I can share it. In the onCreate method, what I need to do then to register this context menu is say first, go grab the actual control. I'm going to say find view of ID, go grab the ID with article. So you grab the article text, then we're going to say register for context menu. So this is going to hook up and say, okay, when you long press on the text of the article, that's when we're going to show a pop-up, a floating menu. Does that make sense? So I'm saying when you long press on the article text, that's where we're going to show it. If you long press on anything else, you won't get it. But if you long press on the article text, you get it there. Now, on the activity, we need to implement those two methods that we just talked about. So we say implement onCreateContextMenu, and we can kind of see it's got a very similar sort of syntax to what we saw a minute ago. We say call the parent implementation, super onCreateContextMenu, and then we say get menu inflator, inflate, yada yada. So it looks almost virtually the same, except that I don't have like a return true at the end. The other thing you may notice, you see that there's more arguments to this method, right? So the previous one for the options menu only took a menu as an input. That was it, right? So I have the menu here, which in this case is a context menu instead of just menu. But I also have the view, and I have this menu info object, right? So this view also tells me which view did they long press. That makes sense? So if I wanted to use one context menu for one control and another context menu for another control, that's where I need to look at this view. Look at the ID of the view and say, if the ID is this, then use this menu. If the ID is that, then use that menu. Make sense? So you might see a switch state menu here. It's pretty normal. Okay. Then I need to implement the actual logic for when you click on a menu item. So I'm going to do a switch. I'm going to switch again on the menu item and say, well, if you did context edit, we'll edit it, return true. If you pick the share, share no, return true, otherwise go run just the parent class's implementation. So you should notice that this implementation of the code I've written here, right, is no different than the action bar. So the code for a context menu is virtually identical. Does that make sense? It's virtually identical.
Is there a reason why you return true?
So returning true is saying that we've done something with it. That return true tells it that it can close the context menu. That makes sense? Otherwise, it would keep the context menu open if we return false. But the only difference between this one and the other one we just saw is really just the name of the method. Right? The name of the method and how you get it. So now let's talk about how to do this contextual action bar, which again is for some more advanced sort of cases. Okay. So the way we get in here, the way this is going to operate, first we're going to long press on the text, but then once we've long pressed on the text, instead of like a little dialog popping up, what's going to change is the action bar is going to go into a different mode, so there'll be different icons there. Okay. So what we see up here, you see there's an edit and a share icon, similar to what we had in the context menu, right? So there's an edit and a share icon, and then I've got this back button here, which is going to take us out of that context, out of that what we call action mode. We're going to get back to the regular action bar, which is good. Does that make sense? So the done items added automatically. These resources, again, come from the menu resource file. They've got a delete icon in there too. Does that kind of make sense? What the goal of that? How this is going to look differently? Again, the idea is that we're doing these actions in the action bar instead of doing them as a problem. So to make this happen, we use what we call in Android an action mode. Okay, so an action mode is kind of a UI mode where we say, okay, let's replace what normally would be there. Let's replace the action bar with our own kind of special action bar for a moment. Okay, so in this case, we long press the text and then we get into action mode. You can actually trigger this action mode any way you like. It could be from a button click, it could be from long pressing on an item, it could really be anything. You could even trigger it from a swipe. But typically we're going to trigger it from a long press. Just know that it doesn't have to be that way. Okay. So to initiate, to get into this action mode, we first need to call the start action mode method. Okay. So we call the start action mode method. We're typically going to call that in the long click listener. So user long presses, we call start action method, and then we start go. Okay. Now, when we call start action mode, we have to give it an action mode callback. Okay. We have to give it an action mode callback, and that's going to tell it what to do as it's in this action mode. Okay. So the action mode callback is an interface that's got 4 methods. I'll go through each of those in turn. So the first one we have here is onCreateContextMenu. That's going to get called initially. On the other side, we've got onDestroyActionMode, which is going to get called when we leave the action, right? So we enter the action mode, we leave the action mode. In between there, we've got something called onPrepareActionMode, which honestly we don't need to worry about too much because we're not actually going to do anything with it. And then thirdly, in here we have onActionItem. Right, so when you click an item, what do you want to do? And what you can see here, right, these are kind of like that same structure that we had with the previous 2 examples. With the context menu and the options menu, we've got onCreate, which is going to do the inflation, and an item click, which is actually going to carry out the action. Does that make sense? So all of these kind of have the same structure to them. And that's the other benefit of extracting logic out of these on item click listeners, because that means I can run the same logic from multiple pathways. Does that make sense? It doesn't necessarily matter where it is in the UI. Here's the action I want it to do. Does that make sense? You might have 2 or 3 ways to get there, but it always does the same thing. If you embed the logic into, say, this on action item clicked, etc., well, then it may do one thing if you go this route and another thing if you go another route, right? And that's not that ideal. Okay. So the process for setting this up. First, we need to create the menu resource, right? As we did with all the other pathways. The next thing I need to do is set up on the long click listener on the view. So I'm going to hook that up here. Hook up the long click listener. That long click listener is going to call start action mode. So the user clicks on the view, and that's where we get our long code fired. Call start action mode. Our callback gets called. The callback. Right. So this first part happens when you do onCreate, and then start action mode gets called when the user actually clicked long presses again. Does that make sense? So that's when we get to finally create the menu. We don't finally create the menu until we actually get into that action method. Okay. And then through there, eventually we'll click on an item, and that's where we'll call our methods, whether we like show settings or edit or share or whatever. So in the onCreate, well, first thing before we do that, we do need to declare a few instance variables. So the first instance variable we're going to declare, this is private action mode and action mode to store the current action mode. Okay, so we're going to store the current action mode in an instance variable. We also, we'll see this on the next slide, also need to create another variable to store the callback. Make sense? So we're going to have 2 new instance variables. One to store the action mode, one to store the callback. Okay. So in onCreate, I need to say, okay, grab the view that we want to handle, and then I'm going to say set on long click listener. This is basically identical to a regular click listener, right? I'm just calling it by a different name. If I set on click listener, that should be if you did a single tap. But here I'm saying long click listener, so it's going to be when you call. Does that make sense? Simple as that. So that's not really anything particularly new. Now, what do I do in the logic when you actually do the long press? Okay, because this is the part that's maybe a bit more interesting. So first of all, I'm saying if the action mode is not null, just return false. So I'm saying if I'm already in an action mode, if you've already done the long press, don't try to get in the action mode again. Just return false, we don't do anything. That makes sense? That's what that's about. So if you do the long press and it's already open, then we don't actually do anything. Okay. Now, if you haven't done the long press, if you're not in the action mode yet, we're going to say main activity.this. We're going to start the action mode, give it a callback, save that to our instance variable. Okay. Now, you may or may not need to say main activity.this. Depends on the context that you're in. Normally, I would just say this, and that refers to what? It refers to the object ring, right? In this case, we're kind of mean, I want the activity that I'm currently in, right? Well, the problem is that once I'm inside of this listener, I'm creating an anonymous class. And that class, inside that class, this actually refers to the listener object. It doesn't refer to the activity anymore. Does that make sense? So inside the listener, this actually refers to the listener, not to the activity. So I have to disambiguate it and say, I don't want the listeners this, I want the activities this. Right? So here it's main activity.this. If I were to put this into second activity, well, this would be second activity.this. Right? If I were to put this in hello world activity, it would be hello world on this. Does that make sense? So you're putting the name of the class that you're actually inside. name of the activity class. That will change. I'm going to say start the action mode, save it, and then typically I'll want to do this, u.setSelected true. So that happens more than likely is going to happen if you have a recycler view or some sort of list. That's going to say highlight it now as selected. Does that make sense? Highlight it and saying that you have selected it. It's different than focused. Focused would actually put focus on it, which I think which happens kind of automatically anyway. But what I'm trying to do is in the list, I'm actually highlighting which items I've selected. Does that make sense? So that's what that's about. And then finally, I return true to say, okay, we've dealt with this long click event. Don't send the long click event off to anybody else. We've dealt with it. Don't let anybody else have it. Because otherwise it might get passed on to other controls. For instance, the recycler view if this was inside the recycler view. That make sense? So that's how I set that up, right? So the important part in there is that I'm calling start action mode and saving it to the instance variable. Okay. If I don't save it to the instance variable, then when I come back in here, it's going to try and create the action mode. Right? I need to give it that callback. Okay. So let's look at how do I write that callback. So the way to write that callback, actually this should be, I don't know why that's public, this should be private. Okay, so I'm going to create that instance variable, and I'm going to say new action mode callback, right? So in this case, I'm saying new well something. What is action mode callback? Is it a class?
Yeah.
What is it? So I do end up with an object. You're saying mActionModeCallback, I do will at the end of this will create an object. But what is action mode callback?
Oh, that's a method.
No,
No, it's not.
it's not a method and it's not a class.
Oh, constructor. No, that's not a method.
So what is it?
Oh, it's an interface.
It's an interface, right? So I'm actually constructing an interface here. Okay. Well, what have you been told about interfaces? What's one of the primary rules of an interface?
If you implement an interface, you have to also implement every method in it.
Okay, well that's important, which I'll have to do in a second. If I want to implement an interface, I have to implement every method, but I haven't said the word implements anywhere here. But you said what about? You said it's an interface.
Yeah.
Right. So it's an interface. Remember, interfaces are kind of like abstract classes. What do you know about abstract classes?
Things can inherit from it, but you can't declare one directly.
What do you mean declare one directly?
Instantiate.
Instantiate one, right?
Yeah.
So I can't instantiate an abstract object, right? Interfaces are the same way. I can't instantiate an interface, right? So if I just said new action mode callback without these brackets and what I'm going to put in these curly brackets, this would not be valid syntax. That makes sense? Because I can't instantiate an interface. Okay. What I'm actually doing here is I'm declaring an anonymous class. Right? This is as if I put it into a whole other class file and actually declared it as a class, but I'm defining it in line. So it is creating a class that implements that interface, but notice that I haven't used the word implements at all. Right? So this is kind of a shorthand. Questions? All right, let's take a quick break. and come back at 150. So, as I was saying, when we create this, we're actually creating a class, right? We're creating a class kind of anonymously, kind of behind the scenes, okay? Now, to backtrack a little bit, remember earlier on in the semester, we talked about compiling your Java classes, right? Your Java files. So let's say I have mActionModeCallback. Right? What file am I going to get when I compile this class? What file name am I going to get through the build process?
Class file.
.class file, right? So I will have main activity .class, right? So this is the source file, and this is what we call the bytecode, right? Okay. Is that clear? Right? So the source code, the bytecode. Well, when I'm creating an anonymous class like this, I still need to create a class file for that anonymous class. Okay, so if I compile this, I will actually get a few class files. So I may get main activity $1 .class and also get one that's $2 .class, etc. So all of these that are anonymous inner classes actually get outputted as separate class files. Does that make sense? Because I really am creating another class, even though it may not look like that immediately. And in this case, I know for sure I'll actually get two, because one of the ones I'm getting here is the callback that I'm implementing. But remember just on the previous step, when I called set on long click listener, the lambda in here or whatever is going to actually create another anonymous class, right? So I have another anonymous class right here, which is where I'm going to have one of these is 2, one of these is 1. Which one they come out to is kind of platform dependent, maybe one way with one version of the compiler and one operating system, or maybe another way. But the thing you need to understand is those actually get compiled out as separate class files. So does that make sense? I'm building one source file, but I'm actually getting multiple class files out. Right? So what I'm seeing here is actually completely a separate class as far as when it runs. Which is also why in here, why I needed to say main activity.this, because I'm kind of in another class. Does that make sense? Okay. So I'm doing the same thing here. So I'm saying, let's create this callback, and I'm going to implement that class or implement that interface anonymously. Okay, so I'm going to put the implementation for that interface right here instead of extracting it to another Java file. Does that make sense? The upside of that is all of these nested classes, all of these anonymous classes can actually access all of my private member variables and my private, all my private methods, right? They still get access to everything that's marked private, which means that I can keep the outside world from actually seeing those classes. If I'd actually extracted this out as a separate class file, then I would have had to make those things public. Does that make sense? For it to get access to it. So it allows me to keep my encapsulation in place by putting them as nested classes, as anonymous classes, instead of extracting them out to a separate file. Does that make sense? That's the upside of doing it this way. Okay. So in order to implement that action mode callback, I need to implement those 4 different methods, right, that make up the interface. So let's go through each of those in turn. And remember, all of these are going to be inside of that callback, right? Where we see this red comment, implement action method, action mode callbacks here, that's where all 4 of these messages will live, okay? So the first one, onCreateContextMenu. So it takes 2 things, takes the action mode object, takes the menu object. Well, you remember, if I have the menu object, then I can inflate the menu into it. So here I'm going to say menu inflator, mode.getMenuInflator. Notice that that's different, right? So up to this point with the previous 2 ones, where did we get the menu inflator? What object did we get the menu inflator from? In the previous 2 examples.
From the class.
From which class?
The outside class.
The outside class, which is a main activity, which is an activity, right? So we got it from effectively the context, right? The previous 2 examples, we got the menu inflator from the context, from the activity. Okay? So here we're actually getting it from the action mode, and that's important. If you leave off the mode.getMenuInflator, you're going to have some problems. So you want to make sure that you write mode.getMenuInflator. Okay. Now, you don't have to save this to a variable. You could say mode.getMenuInflator right here. That's fine. I was just trying to keep this second line short. So I can say get the menu inflator and then inflate, give it the ID again, menu context, menu. Right, so this isn't really all that different from what we just saw, right? The only difference is I'm getting a menu inflator from mode instead of getting it from the context. Otherwise, this is the exact same as the first example. Does that make sense? That's the one gotcha. Okay. The next method that we need to implement is onPrepareActionMode. And this gets called the first time you show the menu, but it also gets called anytime we kind of need to refresh the action mode. Okay. Now, nothing we do at this point is going to make that happen. So just put return false in to say we're not going to do anything. That makes sense? So if we were going to change the menu, we would re-inflate it and then we'd return true. But for nothing, for everything we're doing right now, the menu just stays constant. We're not swapping them.
So when you you said that the onCreateActionMode is only called once each time, or like it's called only like the initial time. Was that just for the first?
That was the very first example,
Okay.
right? That's the one special case. So with the action bar, that only gets created once. But for the context menus, that can get created more than once because remember, you can have one context menu for this control. If I long press this image, I get one context menu. If I long press a second image, I get a second context menu. That makes sense? So it's really the only case where onCreate only gets called once is for the action bar, for the option menu. All the other 3 examples here, onCreate can actually get called more than once. That make sense? So that's one of the things that you need to know in there. Okay, so on prepare action mode, literally all you have to do in there is just return false. Say we're not doing anything, we're not changing the menu. Okay. On action item clicked, it works the same way as all the others ones that we've seen. So we say take the menu item, get the ID of what you picked, and then say, okay, if you picked share, then we're going to share. If you pick edit, we're going to go edit, etc. So we're going to say run the logic, and at the end we're going to say return true, just like we did previously. But in the middle here, we've got mode.finish. See that? So this is what's different. This is one of those things that's again different with this example. So if we're using this action mode, this contextual action mode, when you perform the action, once we perform the action, we're going to say mode.finish so that we leave the action mode. So we go back to the normal action bar. Okay. Now, if we wanted to stay in the action mode for whatever reason, then we just leave out the finish. Makes sense? So if you leave that out, it's still going to stay in the action mode. That's just to get it to leave, because usually once we've done the thing, we want to get out of it. Okay. And then finally, when we destroy the action mode, we're going to say mActionModeCallback. So remember, this is an instance variable back on the main activity. So I'm saying once you destroy it, set the main action mode to null so that we can come back in here, right? So the next time when you do a long press, it creates a new action mode. If I don't do this, we'll leave the action mode, but we'll never be able to get back in because of that check we had in the long quick listener. Does that make sense? And that's why that's there. Okay. So we've gone through 3 of the 4. Do you have something to say? Okay. So that's kind of how that works. Okay. Finally, the pop-up menu, which honestly is kind of probably the least used of these 4 different ways of using a menu, typically shows up as a sort of vertical list, and it's going to be anchored to wherever the view that you're popping out from. So let's say I long press on an image, it's going to pop up on that image, right? So these don't have to be in your action bar. They can be any control. So I might click here. They're kind of examples that they've got here. Is say maybe on an email, you kind of long press and you're going to get, or you click this drop down and you're going to get a reply all or forward option. Potentially might be things that you wanted to see. Okay. So again, kind of going through the steps, the process of setting this up. First, we need to create the XML for the menu. Step 1 as always. And then we also need to add in a button that the user is going to click on. So this first XML is the menu XML, and here we're talking about the layout XML. So the layout, we need to add a button. The user clicks on that button. The click listener then is going to trigger, hey, I want to open up the menu, and then we respond to the item that they click, right? So the part we care most about is this little pig piece in here, is how do I set up that menu? Okay. So in this example, we're going to say, okay, we're going to have an image button that the user clicks on or taps on. That's going to pop up this menu, which is going to do actions. So we create the menu, we add the image button to the layout. We're going to set an on-click listener on there. Now we can either do that on-click listener through the XML, as you've seen, or we can do that through code. Either of those are valid. So once that pops up, we then need to call this on menu item click listener and implement that. So let's look here. So here's the XML for the layout. So I've got wrap content, ID of this button pop up. I've got an icon on it, and maybe my button looks a little bit like this. Okay, going back to the world of the code, I need an instance field to store the actual button. Okay, and then I'm going to say find view by ID. Once I find it, I'm going to say mbutton.set on click listener. Right, so run this code when the user taps on the image button. Okay. Now inside of there, I need to do the actual implementation of what do I want the user to do when they tap on that button. Okay, so inside of that kind of on-click event, right, here's what I'm writing to handle that event. So first I'm creating a pop-up menu, saying new pop-up menu, giving it the current context, as well as the button that I want it to appear next to. Note again that I'm doing main activity.this because I'm also still in an anonymous class, right? Anytime we create a listener, we're creating an anonymous class. Okay. So I create a pop-up menu, and then in the pop-up menu, that's where I'm going to say pop-up.getMenuInflater. So create the pop-up, inflate the menu, and I say, in order to do that, I need the ID. Right? So I've called my XML resource menu_pop-up, and I'm going to say pop-up.getMenu. Right? So the pop-up menu has two important methods here. One to get the menu inflator, and one to get the actual menu. Right? In the previous examples, the menu got passed in as a parental. But when we're creating a pop-up menu, we actually have to say, go grab the menu ourselves, basically. Now, an important thing to note, while this menu is a view, the pop-up menu class itself is not a view. Okay. So it's not actually the pop-up menu class itself doesn't become part of the view hierarchy. The menu does, but not the pop-up menu class. So we're going to say pop-up.set menu item click listener. So this is where we're in the onClick listener for clicking the button. And then inside of here, I'm going to have another click listener that is listening for when we pick an item from that pop-up menu. That makes sense? So we're kind of 2 levels deep. You click on the button, you get the menu, and then you click an item in the menu, and that's where this next piece of code is going to go. And it looks like this. So it's another delegate. So we say, take the item that you picked, switch on the item ID, do whatever logic we want for, say you pick the forward item, do that logic, return true, otherwise return false. So you can see even that's got basically the same structure as the other 3 examples that we did. So the basic structure of all 4 of those is you have a create method of some sort where you have to inflate the menu. And then once the user picks an item, you have some sort of switch statement that's going to go through the possible menu items. Questions? Because that's the end of what I want to talk about today. We'll talk about dialog boxes tomorrow, which is the next half of 4.3. So to go back and review, right? So we talked about 4 different ways to use a menu, right? So we talked about how to use it in the action bar. We talked about how to use it in kind of a contextual menu, where you long press on an item and then you get this pop-up window. Or you long press on an item and you get into, let's change the action bar, right? Change it into the open action mode. Or I just want to put a pop-up menu on a control in the middle of my user. Questions? Okay. So what I want you to do for the labs if you go into the 4.3 labs, they're kind of giving you an overview of what all you're going to do here. So the first part of this is going to have you go into the Droid Cafe and continue with the Droid Cafe to add this overflow menu up top and potentially some icons. So that's task 1 through 3. Okay, so I want you to do tasks 1 through 3 today, and then the coding challenge is going to build on that. So that's all you need to finish today is the first 3 tasks and then this first coding challenge. Tomorrow, what you'll do then is tasks 4 and 5 and coding challenge 2. Does that make sense? So they've kind of already got it broken up into 2 parts, which is why it's like, well, we'll break it up into 2 days. What were you going to say, Alex? What were you trying to say, Alex?
I was just wondering if we were going to do the coding challenge or not.
Yeah, so do the first coding challenge today, and then you'll do the second coding challenge tomorrow. And the homework you'll also do. You can also start on, but a lot. I think
Until dial.
yeah. So all of that will be tomorrow.